A lonely woman begins receiving heartfelt love letters from a stray dog, but the shocking truth behind the dog's nightly visits will leave her, and you, heartbroken. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Watch as a bond forms that proves love can come from the most unexpected places. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The soft hum of crickets filled the warm evening air as Claire stepped out onto her small porch, the familiar quiet of her suburban neighborhood wrapping around her like a cocoon. She loved this time of day, the moments just before the world settled into sleep, where everything felt peaceful and still. Her home, a modest two-story house nestled at the end of a tree-lined street, had always been her sanctuary. But tonight, as she breathed in the crisp autumn air, Claire couldn't shake the emptiness that seemed to linger in the pit of her stomach. It had been nearly a year since her last relationship ended, and though she had tried to move on, she still found herself drifting through her days in a haze. Life had become a routine: work, a quiet dinner, and then the long, solitary hours stretching ahead into the night. She'd come to terms with the loneliness, convinced that perhaps it was just her fate. After all, there was little in her life that seemed to spark joy anymore. Her eyes scanned the street, taking in the rows of houses, each one looking the same as the next. The neighborhood was calm, almost too calm, as if frozen in time. A perfect place for someone who valued peace over everything else. Yet, despite its perfection, Claire couldn't help but feel disconnected from it all, like an outsider in her own life. As she stood there, lost in thought, something unusual caught her attention, a flicker of movement near the edge of her porch. Claire turned, squinting into the fading light. At first, she thought it might be a stray cat or a raccoon rummaging through the bushes, but as her gaze focused, her breath caught in her throat. There, sitting at the foot of her doorstep, was a dog. It wasn't large, but it wasn't small either, more of a medium-sized mutt, its fur a patchwork of browns and whites. The dog looked rough around the edges, scruffy and disheveled, as if it hadn't been properly cared for in quite some time. Its ears were perked up, its eyes wide and alert, yet there was something in the way it looked at her that made Claire's heart ache. It wasn't fear, nor aggression, but something else: loneliness. Or perhaps sadness. For a moment, Claire simply stood there, unsure of what to do. She had always been a dog lover, but the idea of approaching a stray was new to her. She wasn't sure if it was safe, or if the dog was even approachable. But as the seconds passed, she noticed the dog didn't move. It sat there patiently, looking up at her with those soulful eyes. Something about it made Claire feel drawn to it, as though the dog was silently asking for help. Claire hesitated, her mind racing. She knew it was risky to approach a stray dog, many of them were skittish, and some could even be aggressive. But she couldn't ignore the pang of empathy that stirred within her. The dog's forlorn expression tugged at her heart, and she found herself stepping off the porch and walking toward it. "Hey there," she called softly, her voice gentle. "Are you lost?" The dog didn't move at first, but as she took another step closer, it shifted slightly, its eyes never leaving hers. Claire stopped a few feet away and crouched down, still careful to respect the space between them. "It's okay," she murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog tilted its head, as if trying to assess her sincerity. Claire's heart melted as she noticed how thin the dog was, its ribs clearly visible beneath its matted coat. It must have been wandering the streets for some time. She could see the dirt in its fur, the weariness in its posture. Slowly, Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out a small dog biscuit she had been carrying around for weeks, just in case she ever came across a dog in need. She held it out, hoping the dog would take it. For a moment, it simply stared at the biscuit, then at her, and Claire wondered if it even remembered what it was like to be loved, to be cared for. But then, to her surprise, the dog took a tentative step forward. It sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it closed the distance between them. Claire held her breath, praying it wouldn't dart away, but instead, the dog took the biscuit gently from her hand. Its eyes softened as it chewed the treat, and Claire couldn't help but smile. "Good boy," she whispered, a small wave of relief washing over her. She had been nervous, but now, she felt a connection to this stray, a bond formed through a simple act of kindness. The dog finished the biscuit and looked up at her again. This time, it didn't retreat. It stayed close, its eyes still filled with that strange, haunting sadness. Claire stood up slowly, unsure of what to do next. She wasn't sure if she should invite the dog inside, or if it would even want to stay. But as she watched the dog sit back down on her doorstep, something inside her told her it wasn't going anywhere. "Do you want to stay for a little while?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with tenderness. The dog didn't bark or wag its tail, but it looked up at her again, and for a brief moment, Claire could have sworn she saw something in its eyes, a flicker of hope, perhaps. Or maybe it was just her imagination. Either way, the dog's silent presence was enough to make her feel a little less alone. Claire stepped back onto the porch and sat down on the wooden steps, her heart heavy with the realization that she hadn't expected something like this today. She hadn't expected to find a dog at her doorstep, nor had she expected that it would make her feel the way it did. She felt connected to the dog in a way she couldn't quite explain, like their loneliness was something they shared, an unspoken understanding. The dog moved closer to her, sitting just a few feet away, but not too close. It wasn't seeking affection, but rather just companionship. Claire stared out into the street, the sun now fully set, and a peaceful silence settled around them both. The world seemed to pause, and in that moment, Claire wasn't alone. Neither of them were. She sat there for a while, thinking. She hadn't felt this way in a long time, like someone cared, like someone was there for her. It wasn't much, just a dog sitting beside her, but it was enough. It was everything. And, as absurd as it seemed, Claire found herself talking to the dog, telling it things she hadn't told anyone in years. "I don't know what I'm doing with my life," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so caught up in my own stuff that I've forgotten what it's like to just feel. To feel like there's something worth caring about." The dog didn't respond, but Claire could almost feel its quiet presence, as though it were listening. It wasn't judging her, wasn't offering advice. It was just there. And that, in itself, was enough. The minutes passed, and before Claire knew it, the evening was slipping into night. She stood up slowly, stretching her arms overhead, then turned back to the dog, who had remained at her side. "I guess you'll have to go now," she said gently, though part of her didn't want to let it go. "It's getting late." To her surprise, the dog didn't get up to leave. It just sat there, looking up at her with those same sad, searching eyes. Claire's heart ached. She didn't want to send it away, but she didn't know what else to do. "I'll leave some food out for you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to leave just yet." She headed inside for a moment, retrieving a small bowl and filling it with water, then another bowl with the last of the dog food she had in the pantry. She placed them outside on the porch, and when she turned around, the dog was still there, watching her intently. As Claire stepped back onto the porch, she felt a strange sense of connection between herself and the dog, an unspoken bond that felt like a lifeline in the middle of her own loneliness. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. It was a start. She gave the dog one last look before closing the door behind her. The dog ate the food and drank the water, and after a while, it stood up and padded quietly away, disappearing into the darkness of the street. But something in Claire's heart told her that it wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. It was late when Claire stepped onto her porch, the air crisp with the bite of autumn, her thoughts as heavy as the full moon hanging in the sky. She had spent the day wrapped in layers of frustration, sitting in her quiet house, staring at the clock as hours ticked by with little to show for them. The emptiness of the house was almost suffocating. Even the walls, once comforting, seemed to press in around her now, whispering of the years she had spent alone. No family nearby, no close friends who could drop by for a casual chat. She had always been the one who quietly slipped into the background, never quite making a mark on the world. Tonight, though, she was determined to get some air and clear her head. She hadn't been out in days, stuck in a routine that was as predictable as it was depressing. She walked out onto her porch, the familiar creak of the wood beneath her feet the only sound accompanying her thoughts. The evening was quiet, too quiet, really. Not a single car passed by, not a dog barked in the distance, and the usual chatter of the neighborhood seemed to be suspended for a while. Claire shivered slightly as a breeze moved through the trees, rustling the few leaves that clung to their branches. She made her way to the railing and leaned against it, looking out over the darkened street, her breath visible in the cool air. As she exhaled, she noticed something odd at the base of her doorstep. There, placed carefully on the ground, was a small, folded piece of paper. At first, she thought it might have been discarded by a passerby or perhaps a stray leaf from a neighbor's yard. But something about the paper caught her eye, almost as if it had been placed intentionally, waiting for her. Curious, she knelt down and reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cool surface. It was crumpled, as if it had been carried in the wind for a while, but it still seemed remarkably intact. She unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to tear it. When she saw what was written, she blinked, her mind taking a moment to process the simple yet profound message scrawled in messy handwriting. "You are not alone." Claire stared at the words in confusion. She turned the paper over, expecting to find more, but there was nothing. Just those 4 words. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The handwriting was uneven, like someone who had written the message in a rush, but the sentiment was clear. She felt a strange chill sweep over her, but it wasn't from the cold. It was as if those words had resonated deep within her, touching something she hadn't realized was still there, a desire to feel seen, to feel understood. For a moment, Claire wondered if she was losing her mind. It seemed unlikely anyone would leave such a cryptic note for her. Who could it have been? The neighbors? She doubted it. Most people around here kept to themselves. She looked around, half expecting to see someone peering from behind a tree or watching from a window, but the street remained empty. No one in sight. A shiver ran down her spine as she stood up, folding the paper and slipping it into her pocket. It was just a silly note, she told herself. Someone's idea of a joke, or perhaps just some random stranger with a message they wanted to pass along. It wasn't worth reading too much into. Still, the words lingered in her mind, playing over and over in her thoughts. You are not alone. How strange. How comforting, and yet, how unsettling. The night was still quiet as Claire returned to her chair on the porch. She tried to shake off the lingering feeling of unease, but the air felt different now. It was as if the world had shifted just slightly, opening up a small, vulnerable corner of her heart that she hadn't realized was there. The message had stirred something deep inside her, but before she could ponder it further, she heard a soft sound at the edge of her porch. Turning her head sharply, Claire's eyes landed on the small figures sitting in the shadows. A dog, just barely visible, its fur a mixture of brown and white, sat patiently at the bottom of her steps. Its head was lowered, its eyes fixated on her in an oddly intense way. Claire froze, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't unusual to see strays in the neighborhood, but she hadn't noticed one like this before. The dog was thin, scruffy, and looked like it hadn't had a proper meal in days. Its eyes, however, were filled with a quiet intelligence, as though it had a message to deliver, though it wasn't sure how to do so. For a long moment, neither moved. The dog stared at her, unblinking, as Claire sat there, wide-eyed and unsure of what to do. Her mind raced, wondering what the dog wanted. Was it lost? Looking for food? She hesitated, but something about the way it looked at her, its gaze so full of yearning, made her want to offer help. Without thinking, she reached inside her house and grabbed a small bowl, filling it with water from the kitchen sink. The dog's eyes never left her as she placed it in front of it. The dog sniffed the water but didn't drink immediately. It simply sat there, watching her. Claire sat still too, her gaze locked with the dog's. It was as though time slowed down, and for a brief moment, everything around them fell silent. The wind stopped blowing. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the dog lowered its head and took a long, slow drink from the bowl. After a few moments, it raised its head, eyes still fixed on her, as if in gratitude. A strange sense of connection bloomed in Claire's chest, a feeling that was both unfamiliar and comforting at the same time. This wasn't just any stray. This dog had found her, had come to her for a reason. She wasn't sure what that reason was, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Something had drawn it to her doorstep, just as the note had. A strange feeling of kinship washed over her. As the dog finished drinking, it stood up, and Claire half expected it to wander off into the night, but it didn't. Instead, it remained there, sitting at the bottom of her steps, its eyes never leaving hers. It wasn't demanding anything, no barking or frantic wagging of the tail. It just sat there, quietly watching her, almost as if waiting for her to understand something. Claire smiled, a soft, tentative smile. She reached out and gently patted the top of the dog's head, feeling the roughness of its fur beneath her hand. For a moment, she was overcome with the need to comfort it, to ease whatever pain it had carried with it. But before she could do or say anything more, the dog turned and walked away, its pace slow and deliberate. As it moved further down the street, Claire watched it disappear into the night, a vague sense of longing rising within her. The next day, she couldn't stop thinking about the dog. It had left without a trace, as if it had never been there at all. But something about it lingered with her, the quiet, knowing look in its eyes, the calm patience with which it waited for her. It felt different than any encounter with a stray dog she had ever had. And then, just as the sun began to set, something strange happened. Another note appeared at her doorstep. This time, the paper was pristine, and the message was simple but clear. There's always hope. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She knew, without a doubt, that the same dog had left this note. It had to have been. The same handwriting, the same delicate placement of the paper. Her mind spun with questions. Was the dog trying to communicate something? Was this some strange coincidence, or was there something more at play? In the stillness of the evening, Claire realized that something was changing within her. The messages, the dog's quiet presence, had somehow stirred a part of her that she had long neglected. A part of her that had given up on hope, on connection. And now, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had once believed. With the second note tucked carefully in her pocket, Claire looked out into the night, her thoughts filled with questions that she wasn't sure how to answer. But one thing was certain, the dog had left her with something that she had forgotten how to feel, a spark of hope, and a reminder that even in the loneliest of places, there could still be a message of love waiting to be discovered. The following days passed in a quiet, almost surreal rhythm. Every night, without fail, the stray dog appeared at the foot of Claire's doorstep, waiting patiently as she placed down the small bowl of food she had come to prepare for it. There was no urgency to its arrival, no frantic desperation that often accompanies an abandoned animal. It was as though the dog had a quiet confidence, as if it knew it would be fed, and it would always be welcomed here. Claire couldn't help but feel a strange connection growing between them, a bond that seemed to extend far beyond mere nourishment. At first, she thought it was just coincidence. Maybe it was the only place the dog could find food, or maybe it simply wandered into her yard out of habit. But as each night passed, she began to realize that the dog wasn't just here for a meal, it was here for something more. And then, it happened again. The dog, after eating its fill, trotted to the far corner of her porch, turned around, and did something unexpected. It left a small, crumpled piece of paper at her doorstep. Claire stood frozen for a moment, staring at the note as if it might be a figment of her imagination. Could it be real? Had the dog somehow brought this with it, or had someone else left it there? The night air was still and cool, the only sound being the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. Claire knelt down slowly and picked up the note. It was just a simple, handwritten message. The words were few, but they seemed to speak directly to her soul. You are not alone. Her heart skipped a beat. The words were so simple, so plain, yet they carried a weight that she could feel deep in her chest. She looked down at the dog, but it was already retreating into the shadows, its figure barely visible in the dim light of the porch. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to make of it. Who could have written this note? The dog? It seemed too unlikely, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this message was meant for her and no one else. She tucked the note into her pocket and went inside, her mind swirling with questions. What did the dog mean by this? Why was it leaving her messages? And who was it speaking for? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something deeper at play here? The following night, the dog returned. This time, it seemed more confident than before, walking straight up to the porch as if it had been there 1,000 times. It stood there for a moment, its eyes locked on hers, and then it sat down, waiting patiently for Claire to bring out the food. Claire did so, feeling a growing sense of fondness for the stray animal, whose quiet presence had begun to fill an empty space in her heart. Once the dog had eaten, Claire went to retrieve the bowl. But again, she found something else. Another note. This one was even simpler than the last, but just as powerful. There's always hope. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She felt a deep, almost instinctual connection to the words. It was as though the dog was speaking directly to her, understanding something she had long forgotten. Hope. She had felt the weight of hopelessness for so long. Her life had been marked by quiet isolation and a sense of resignation. The loss of her husband had left an emptiness inside her that had never fully healed. Over the years, she had convinced herself that hope was something that belonged to others, something that wasn't for people like her. But this dog, this strange creature that had appeared in her life without warning, seemed to be telling her otherwise. Hope, she whispered to herself, touching the note gently. The words seemed to vibrate in her chest as she turned back to the dog. It watched her silently, its brown eyes gleaming in the dim porch light, as if it understood the significance of the message. Claire couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude for this animal that had so unexpectedly become a part of her life. It wasn't just a stray anymore, it was something more, something she could not yet put into words. The next few nights passed in much the same way. Each evening, Claire would leave food for the dog, and each night, after it had eaten, it would leave another note. The messages were always simple, always direct, but they seemed to touch something deep inside Claire. Each one felt like a small lifeline, pulling her from the darkness she had been living in for so long. One night, she came outside with the food as usual, but this time, something was different. The air was thick with anticipation, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Claire felt as though this night would bring something significant. She set down the bowl and looked around, half expecting the dog to appear from the shadows as it had every other night. But it didn't. Minutes passed, and Claire began to wonder if she had missed it, or if maybe the dog had wandered off. Her heart sank a little at the thought of it. She had grown used to the dog's nightly visits, and now the idea of not seeing it felt wrong. She waited for another few moments, then sighed, deciding to go back inside. Just as she turned to leave, she caught a movement in the corner of her eye. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the shadows just beyond her porch, stood the dog. It was watching her with those same soulful eyes, the same quiet presence that had drawn her to it in the first place. And in front of it, placed gently on the ground, was yet another note. This one was different, though. It was larger, more deliberate, as if it had been placed there with great care. Claire walked over slowly, feeling her pulse quicken with each step. She picked up the note and unfolded it, her hands trembling with a strange mixture of excitement and fear. The words were written in a neat, elegant script. "I'm here." Claire's throat tightened. The message was so simple, yet the meaning was impossible to ignore. The dog wasn't just offering hope, or reminding her that she wasn't alone. This note, this message, felt more like a promise, like the dog was telling her that it would always be there, waiting, watching, and never leaving her. She stared at the note for a long time, the weight of its message sinking in. The dog's silent companionship, its quiet understanding, was becoming more than just an animal at her doorstep. It was something that filled a gap inside her heart that she hadn't even known was there. It was as though, for the first time in years, Claire was beginning to feel the faintest stirrings of something she had almost forgotten: connection. Over the next few nights, the letters continued to come. Each one was different, but all of them shared the same quiet, reassuring tone. Some were shorter than others, just a few words scribbled quickly, while others were longer, more thoughtful. But each note seemed to touch Claire in ways she couldn't explain. You matter. You are seen. I'm here for you. Each message carried its own weight, and together they painted a picture of something she had never imagined, a love that could exist without expectation, without need for anything in return. But despite the comfort the notes provided, Claire still couldn't understand why the dog was doing this. What had happened to it? Why was it leaving her these messages? Was it simply an animal with a kind heart, or was there something deeper at play? She decided to learn more about the dog. One evening, after she had set down the food and the dog had eaten, Claire decided to follow it. She waited for a moment, watching as the dog lingered by the edge of the porch, its eyes glinting in the dark. When it turned to leave, she followed it quietly, keeping her distance so that it wouldn't feel threatened. The dog led her through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, its pace slow but steady. They passed houses, quiet and dark, and finally, the dog stopped at the end of the street. It turned and looked back at Claire, as if waiting for her to catch up. Claire approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, the dog led her to the corner of the street, where an old, abandoned house stood, its windows dark and uninviting. The dog stopped in front of the house and sat down. Claire stared at the house, her mind racing. Something about this place felt significant. She looked back at the dog, and then it clicked. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The dog had been waiting here, hadn't it? Had it once belonged to someone who lived in this house? The truth, when it finally arrived, hit Claire like a wave. The dog had been abandoned. Left behind. It had waited for its family to return, day after day, month after month, and when they never did, it had found its way to Claire's door. The letters, the notes, the quiet messages, it wasn't just the dog offering comfort to her. It had been offering its heart, its hope, its love, to someone who understood what it was like to be abandoned, to wait for something that would never come. And in that moment, Claire knew the dog wasn't just a stray. It was a soul that had known loss and loneliness just like her. And through its small, quiet acts of kindness, it had helped her heal in ways she never thought possible. She stood there in the darkness, her heart full, tears silently streaming down her face, as the dog, her faithful companion, sat beside her, its eyes soft and full of understanding. The rain had stopped, and a thick fog hung over the small suburban neighborhood, giving everything an ethereal quality. It was as though the world had been temporarily washed clean, and nothing felt quite the same anymore. Claire stood on her porch, looking out into the mist, the familiar weight of loneliness pressing against her chest. The stray dog had not appeared the night before. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Nor the night before that. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what life might be like without the dog. Without those little notes of reassurance left at her doorstep, without the soft, understanding gaze the dog always gave her whenever she stepped outside. It felt as though a hole had opened up where something special once existed. It was silly, she thought, to miss a dog she barely knew. But in the weeks since their first meeting, the dog had become an unspoken comfort in her life. It was like a small, fragile thread of connection that tied her to the outside world in a way she hadn't felt in years. She pushed the thought away as she walked back inside, her mind preoccupied with the usual routines that came with a solitary life. The days blurred together. There was always work, the occasional grocery run, a meal for one. But the absence of the dog felt more than just the absence of an animal, it felt like a piece of the puzzle had gone missing. Her phone buzzed with a reminder to pick up a prescription. Claire sighed, glancing at the time. It had been a long day, but she knew the routine would help ease the heaviness she felt in her chest. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, Claire found herself outside again, this time without even thinking about it. She hadn't planned to, but the urge to check the porch felt almost magnetic. It was as if her feet had carried her there without consulting her brain. To her surprise, the dog was waiting. It was sitting at the base of the stairs, its head tilted upward, eyes gleaming in the dimming light. It seemed different somehow. A little more regal, a little more patient. It had been a few nights since its last visit, but tonight the dog seemed to know exactly what was expected. It waited for her to notice it, a silent acknowledgement of their unspoken bond. The moment their eyes met, something shifted between them. Claire felt her heart flutter in her chest, a warmth spreading through her body that she hadn't felt in a long time. The dog was back. It didn't move as she stepped forward, keeping its eyes fixed on hers. She could see the faint outline of its ribs through its matted fur, and the signs of neglect that still lingered, though the dog had clearly been fed regularly in recent weeks. But there was something else, something deeper in its gaze. It was a kind of recognition, something familiar, like the two of them had met in a dream and were now, somehow, reunited. Claire knelt down to the dog, a tentative gesture, unsure whether it would retreat as it had in the past. But it didn't. Instead, it allowed her to approach, its eyes never leaving her face. She took a deep breath and reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned in, pressing its head against her palm, as if to say, "I trust you." Her heart ached at the tenderness of the gesture. She hadn't known it was possible to feel this deeply for a stray animal, someone, or something, that had no real claim on her life. But in this moment, it felt like they had known each other forever. Without thinking, Claire sat down on the porch steps next to the dog. She didn't rush to feed it, didn't try to get it to play or do anything other than simply be there. They sat in silence, with only the sounds of the quiet neighborhood and the distant hum of cars passing by. It was an odd kind of peace, this shared moment of stillness between a woman and a dog who had both, in their own ways, felt forgotten. Minutes passed before the dog finally moved, standing up and walking a few steps away. Claire watched as it paced slowly around the porch, its tail swishing lazily behind it. It stopped, as if to make sure she was still there, then continued on its quiet patrol. Claire smiled, unable to help herself. It was as if the dog was guarding her, even though she had no idea what it was guarding against. What could a dog like this, so clearly alone, possibly be protecting? As she sat, the thought lingered. This dog, abandoned and unwanted, had become her protector. And in return, she had become his sanctuary. The dog circled the porch a few more times before it stopped in front of her again. This time, it sat down and looked up at Claire expectantly. She took the cue, reaching inside her bag to pull out the small container of food she had brought just in case. The dog waited patiently, its eyes never leaving her face as she set the food down in front of it. For a moment, Claire was lost in thought. She didn't even realize that she had started to talk to the dog, her words flowing freely in the way they sometimes did when she was alone. "I never thought I'd end up talking to a dog," she said with a soft laugh, glancing down at the animal as it ate. "I used to think I'd be more put together, you know? But now, here we are." The dog looked up at her for a brief moment, then returned to its meal. Claire's laugh faded, but she didn't mind. The dog didn't need her to explain herself. It didn't need her to put on any kind of act. It simply needed her to be real, to be present. As the dog finished eating, it stood up again and, as if remembering something, moved over to the far corner of the porch. Claire watched with curiosity, but she didn't move. The dog trotted back to her with something clutched in its mouth. It was a piece of paper, crumpled but carefully folded. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The dog dropped it at her feet, its gaze fixed on her as though waiting for her to read it. Claire hesitated, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the note. She read the familiar words once again. "There's always hope." The same message from before. For a moment, Claire sat still, the paper heavy in her hands. The words were simple, but their impact was profound. It was as if the dog was reminding her, no, telling her, that there was still something to hold on to. That even in a world that could be cruel and isolating, there was always hope. She didn't know how a stray dog could understand that, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The message was meant for her, and somehow, she understood. Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She didn't want to appear weak in front of the dog, even though it had already shown her more compassion than she could have imagined. She couldn't remember the last time someone had cared about her in this way. Not even her friends, those who had once been close, had offered her this kind of unconditional acceptance. The dog, oblivious to the emotions swirling inside her, simply stood by her side, its head resting gently against her leg. It wasn't asking for anything. It wasn't demanding anything. It was just there. Claire took a deep breath, her heart swelling with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The dog looked up at her, its eyes soft but knowing. And for the first time in years, Claire felt truly seen. The evening air was thick with the scent of rain as Claire closed the door behind her, stepping out onto the porch. The droplets fell steadily from the dark sky, splashing gently on the ground and creating small pools of water at her feet. She pulled the collar of her jacket tighter, trying to shield herself from the chill of the late autumn night. For the past few weeks, the stray dog had visited her doorstep like clockwork. Each night, it left her a new note, each message more comforting than the last. It wasn't like any other stray she had encountered before. Most dogs were cautious around humans, but this one seemed different. It wasn't fearful. It wasn't anxious. It was calm, even gentle, as though it knew something Claire had yet to understand. She began to look forward to its visits. Each letter the dog left seemed to speak directly to her heart. It was almost as if the dog understood her loneliness, her yearning for something more in her life. But tonight, something felt off. Claire's usual feeling of anticipation was overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of unease. There was no dog waiting for her at the foot of the porch, no scruffy, wet animal with those soulful eyes, no small piece of crumpled paper left behind. She stared out into the night, waiting, hoping to see the familiar shape appear, but the street remained eerily quiet. Her gaze moved across the dimly lit yard, but there was nothing, no sign of the dog. As she reached down to pick up the empty bowl she had placed out earlier, Claire's thoughts swirled. She had come to care for the dog, more than she had ever expected. Despite the briefness of their encounters, despite the oddness of the situation, she felt a deep connection with it. But now, the absence of the dog felt like a silent void, an emptiness she couldn't explain. Something had changed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something crucial. The next morning came with no sign of the dog. Claire sat at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly as she glanced out the window, her thoughts lingering on the missing animal. The night before had been the first time it hadn't shown up, and now it was beginning to worry her. Could something have happened to it? Had it been hurt, or worse, had it disappeared forever? Unable to shake her concern, Claire decided to take action. She couldn't sit around waiting for the dog to return, not without knowing more about it. Something told her that this was no ordinary stray. Its presence, the letters, and the deep emotional connection she felt with it, it all had to mean something. The dog hadn't just been visiting her porch by chance. There was a reason behind its nightly appearances, and Claire was determined to find out what it was. After finishing her coffee, Claire grabbed her raincoat and headed out. She didn't know where to start looking, but she had a hunch. Over the past few days, the dog had always seemed to follow a particular route, appearing at the same spot at the same time each night. She figured that if she could retrace its steps, she might find some clue about where it was going, or better yet, why it was leaving those notes. She walked briskly through the neighborhood, past familiar houses and quiet streets, but still no sign of the dog. Her heart sank with each passing block. Had she waited too long? Had the dog left for good? Just as she was beginning to lose hope, she spotted something ahead of her. There, at the end of a narrow street, stood an old, weathered house. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and tangled vines. The house looked abandoned, as though no one had lived there for years. And yet, as Claire approached, she saw a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. There, standing in the shadows of the front yard, was the dog. It was watching her. A flood of emotions rushed over Claire as she stopped in her tracks. She had found it. The dog was here, waiting. But why had it led her here, to this rundown, forgotten house? What was the connection between the dog and this place? Her curiosity urged her forward, and she took cautious steps toward the house. The dog didn't move, its gaze fixed on her, almost as if it had been expecting her. The rain had intensified, turning the pavement into a slick, wet surface, but Claire didn't mind. She was too focused on the mystery unfolding before her. As she reached the edge of the yard, the dog finally stirred. It walked toward her slowly, as if it were inviting her to follow. Claire's heart raced as she glanced at the house. The front door stood ajar, slightly creaking in the wind, as though waiting for someone to enter. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "I'm here." The dog looked at her one last time, then turned and padded softly toward the door, its movements deliberate, as though it had a clear purpose. Claire hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with questions, but then she followed. She wasn't sure what she would find, but she knew that whatever it was, she had to understand. She had to know the truth. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of mildew was thick in the room. The walls were lined with faded photographs, many of them old, some barely recognizable. The furniture, though sparse, appeared to have once been well cared for, now covered in sheets and layers of dust. The dog stopped just inside the doorway and looked back at Claire, its tail wagging slowly. It stepped further into the house, and Claire followed, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of life or activity. As she moved deeper into the house, she noticed a small, weathered photo frame sitting on a dusty table near the window. She picked it up carefully, wiping away the layers of dust to reveal a picture of a family, 2 adults and a young child, standing together in front of the very same house. Claire's fingers trembled as she stared at the photo. She recognized the dog instantly. It was the same animal that had been visiting her doorstep every night. In the photograph, the dog was much younger, its coat cleaner and brighter. But the child's eyes, those were the same eyes that had watched her from the porch, the same eyes that seemed to hold a world of unspoken emotion. The dog had once belonged to this family. Claire felt a lump form in her throat as she pieced together the story. The family in the photograph was gone, likely having moved away, leaving the dog behind. It had waited here, at this house, hoping for its owners to return. But they never had. It had stayed, alone and abandoned, searching for love and companionship in the only way it knew how. The dog's sad eyes looked up at Claire, as if acknowledging the realization that had just dawned upon her. Claire's heart broke as she understood the depth of the dog's pain. This animal had known loss in a way that Claire had never fully comprehended. It had waited for someone who would never come back. The dog had been visiting Claire's doorstep not just for food, but for something more. It had been looking for love, for someone who could see it, who could recognize the hurt and the longing in its heart. And Claire, in her own way, had been doing the same. She had been searching for connection, for comfort, for someone to understand her grief and loneliness. They had found each other. Tears filled Claire's eyes as she knelt down beside the dog, wrapping her arms around it gently. The dog pressed its head into her chest, seeking solace, and Claire whispered softly, "I'm here now. You're not alone anymore." In that moment, Claire knew that their bond was not just the result of chance. The dog had been seeking a home, and so had she. They had found each other when they needed it most, and in their shared grief, they had created a quiet, powerful connection. As the rain continued to fall, Claire and the dog sat together in the abandoned house, no longer strangers but kindred spirits, united by the love they had both been searching for. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The dog had given Claire something she had lost long ago, a sense of belonging, of being seen. And in return, Claire would offer the same love and companionship, ensuring that the dog would never be alone again. They both had their scars, but together, they had found healing. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, the steady drip-drip of droplets pattering against the porch a quiet lullaby. Claire sat on her stoop, staring out into the wet streets, waiting. The silence was deep, almost suffocating. For the first time in weeks, the familiar, comforting sight of the stray dog had not appeared. She had been standing here for nearly an hour now, her hands clasped tightly around a steaming mug of tea, trying to hold on to hope. She couldn't explain why the dog's absence felt so heavy, so wrong. It had become a part of her nightly routine. The dog always came around this time, its tail wagging slightly as it approached her doorstep with a new letter in its mouth. Each letter had carried simple, poignant words of comfort, written in neat handwriting that betrayed its true purpose, love. And every night, without fail, Claire had felt a little less alone. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was no letter, no scruffy figure in the distance, no tail wagging in the shadows. The wet ground remained undisturbed. Claire felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Something was wrong. For weeks, she had been pouring her heart out to the dog, confiding in it as if it were her closest friend. She had cried on its fur, felt the warmth of its presence when no one else was around, and found solace in the silent bond that had formed between them. But tonight, that bond felt fragile, broken. Had something happened to the dog? Was it lost again, or worse, hurt? Claire shivered at the thought. The wind picked up, sending a chill through her, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her body. She glanced toward the street corner where the dog usually appeared, her heart racing as she looked for any sign of movement. Nothing. The familiar figure didn't emerge from the shadows, and Claire's chest tightened with worry. She couldn't remember a time when she had felt so connected to something, so tethered to a presence that wasn't even her own. She had given the dog a small part of herself every night, telling it everything she couldn't say to anyone else. She had shared her loneliness, her insecurities, her deep yearning for something more than the solitude that filled her life. And in return, the dog had offered her something simple and pure, an unspoken promise of companionship. Claire stood up, her legs stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. She walked slowly to the edge of the porch, her eyes scanning the dark street as the wind whipped through her hair. It was then that she noticed something in the distance. A small figure, almost indistinguishable in the darkness, was standing motionless on the sidewalk. Claire's heart leapt in her chest. Was it the dog? She squinted, willing her eyes to focus on the silhouette. As she stepped forward, she saw the familiar form of the stray dog slowly make its way toward her. But something was different. The dog's usual lively gait was now a slow, almost lethargic shuffle. Its head hung low, and it walked with the kind of exhaustion that seemed too heavy for its frail body to carry. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The dog's eyes, usually so bright with an inexplicable warmth, now looked dull, empty. It was as if the life had been drained from them. Her heart ached with the sudden realization that this wasn't the same dog that had greeted her every night. This was a dog that had been through something deep, something painful. The dog stopped in front of her, its body trembling slightly. It didn't raise its head to look at her. Didn't wag its tail as it normally would. It just stood there, its gaze focused on the ground. Claire dropped to her knees, her heart pounding. She reached out slowly, gently, trying not to startle it. As her fingers brushed against its fur, the dog let out a low whimper, a sound that broke Claire's heart. "Hey, hey there," she whispered softly, her voice trembling. "What happened? Are you okay?" The dog didn't respond, but Claire could feel the sadness radiating off of it. She sat on the wet pavement, pulling the dog gently into her lap, cradling it as she had done so many times before. She could feel its ribs through its matted fur, and the thinness of its body sent a shudder through her. Had it been eating? Had it been taken care of? Or had it been wandering the streets, lost and forgotten? "I'm here, okay," she murmured, her hand gently stroking the dog's back. "I'm here." The dog didn't move, its breathing shallow and slow. Claire felt the heaviness in her chest as she held the animal, knowing something was wrong, but not understanding what. There was a story here, a reason for its suffering, but she didn't know it yet. All she knew was that this dog, who had been so full of life when it had first come to her, was now a shell of its former self. And then, as if on cue, the dog shifted slightly, its head raising just enough to look Claire in the eyes. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw something flicker in its gaze. There was recognition there. A quiet acknowledgement of the connection they had shared over the past few weeks. But there was something more, something deeper, a sense of finality, as if the dog knew something she didn't. The dog's lips parted slightly, and Claire thought she saw it struggling to breathe, its chest heaving with effort. She leaned in closer, pressing her ear to its side, but the dog was no longer trembling in fear. It was trembling with something else, something sadder, more resigned. It was the kind of trembling that came with a knowledge of an ending, an awareness that something precious was slipping away. And then, as Claire sat there holding the dog, she heard a faint rustling from the ground. She pulled back slightly and noticed something small lying beneath the dog's paws, a crumpled piece of paper, barely visible beneath its weight. Her breath caught in her throat. The dog had left her one more letter. She gently removed the note from under the dog's paws, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, neat, and careful, as always. She read the words aloud in a whisper, her voice cracking with emotion. "I've found my peace. Thank you for showing me love when I had none left." The words hit Claire like a wave, a rush of emotions flooding through her all at once. The dog had always known, somehow, that it had given her something precious, something she hadn't even realized she needed until it had arrived in her life. And now, it was giving her one last gift, a final letter, a farewell. The dog had found peace, and in its own quiet way, it was telling Claire that it was okay to let go. Claire's eyes blurred with tears as she read the last few words again, trying to make sense of the heartache that surged within her. She didn't know how long she sat there, holding the dog, feeling the finality of it all. She had been so focused on the dog's presence, so drawn to its love, that she hadn't realized how much it had given her in return. It had been there for her when no one else had, offering her unconditional companionship in the darkest of moments. And now, in its own quiet, sorrowful way, it was asking her to let go. As Claire sat there in the rain, cradling the dog in her arms, she understood. The dog had been waiting for something more than just survival. It had been waiting for the kind of love that made it feel whole again. And now, it was leaving her with that love, in the form of this letter, this final act of grace. She held the dog a little tighter, her tears falling freely, knowing that the bond they had shared would never be forgotten. Even though the dog was slipping away, its love, its message, would remain in her heart forever. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Claire stood at the door of her home, the wind picking up slightly, carrying with it a chill that seemed to match the emptiness she felt inside. It had been 2 weeks since the last letter, since the last time she had seen the stray dog. 2 weeks of waiting, waiting for the dog to return, waiting for another note, for another connection. But it hadn't come. And with each passing day, the space where the dog used to be, where its quiet presence had once filled the air with something simple but profound, grew more and more like an aching void. Claire had tried to stay hopeful, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the dog would show up. She had checked her porch every morning and every night, but the only thing she found were the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of cars, the occasional bark from another dog down the block. The stray dog, the one who had left her those cryptic, loving notes, had vanished as quietly as it had appeared. She had tried to make sense of it all, but nothing about it felt right. The dog had been so persistent, leaving her messages that had slowly chipped away at the wall she had built around her own heart. Each note, each carefully written word, had pierced through her loneliness in ways she hadn't even realized she needed. The dog had been there for her in its own way, providing her with a quiet comfort, as if it had known that she needed it more than she could ever express. Claire hadn't realized how deeply the dog's presence had affected her until it was gone. The silence in her home had grown unbearable. Every room, once filled with the quiet echo of her own footsteps and the occasional sound of the dog's paws against her porch, felt cold and empty now. She spent her evening staring out of the window, looking out at the street where the dog had once sat, its eyes following her every move. The neighborhood had never felt so quiet. She had tried calling for it a few times, standing on her porch and calling the dog's name, even though she didn't know it. She had given it names in her mind, names like Buddy or Charlie, but none of them seemed to fit. Still, she called out every night, hoping that the dog would answer, hoping that the small, scruffy creature who had brought so much warmth to her life would return. But there was no answer. Claire had begun to think that maybe the dog had simply moved on. Maybe it had found another porch, another person to offer its love to. Perhaps it had decided that it had given all it could give, and now it needed to find peace elsewhere. But a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deeper that she wasn't seeing, something that kept her glued to the hope that it would return. On that particular evening, as the darkness crept in and the streetlights flickered on, Claire stepped out of her house one last time, the last remnants of the day's sunlight stretching across the pavement. She walked down the driveway, her feet heavy with the weight of loss. The world felt so much larger now, and she was so small in it. Her thoughts drifted, remembering the moments she had shared with the dog, the quiet companionship, the gentle trust that had grown between them, the way the dog's presence had made everything feel just a little bit more bearable. She reached the end of the driveway and paused. The street was silent, save for the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. No cars were passing, no children were playing. It felt like the world had stopped, just as her heart had. She looked down the road, toward the little abandoned house where the dog had led her on that fateful evening when she had discovered its past. She remembered standing there in front of the empty house, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the dog had waited there for so long, alone, heartbroken, hoping for its family to return. But they never did. And now the dog was gone, leaving only a few letters behind. With a sigh, Claire turned back toward her house, feeling the weight of her own quiet despair settling over her like a thick, suffocating blanket. She stood in front of her door and placed her hand on the knob, preparing to go inside, when something caught her eye. There, at her doorstep, was a single piece of paper. Her heart skipped a beat, and she knelt down quickly to pick it up. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, and as she did, she found that the handwriting was familiar, the words striking a deep chord within her. "I've found my peace. Thank you for showing me love when I had none left." Her breath caught in her throat, and a sudden wave of emotion hit her. She placed her hand over her mouth, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She knew, without a doubt, that the message had come from the dog. It was its final goodbye, its final expression of gratitude for the small piece of happiness Claire had given it. Claire sank to her knees, the weight of the words sinking in. The dog had left her not just letters, but a piece of its soul, a piece of its heart. It had trusted her in a way that was rare and beautiful, and now, as she read its words, Claire realized how deeply the dog had touched her. The dog hadn't just been a stray on her doorstep, it had been a companion, a friend, a silent confidant. And in the end, it had given her something that went beyond any letter, the reminder that even in the darkest of times, love could still be found. She wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself, but the tears wouldn't stop. She looked around, as if searching for the dog, hoping against hope that it would be there, standing in the shadows, watching her with those soulful eyes. But the street was empty, as it had been for days. The dog was gone. Her heart ached with the finality of it all, but deep down, Claire knew that this was the way things were meant to be. The dog had come into her life for a reason, to show her that love could find its way into even the loneliest of hearts. It had taught her to open up, to trust again, and to believe that there was always something more to look forward to, even in the quietest of moments. As she stood there, holding the letter in her hands, a small, unexpected sense of peace washed over her. The dog had found its peace, just as it had promised. And maybe, just maybe, so had she. Claire stood up, clutching the note to her chest. She walked back into her house, closing the door behind her. The house no longer felt as cold, no longer felt as empty. It wasn't just the absence of the dog that had left her feeling hollow, it was the absence of love, of connection. But now, with the dog's final note in her hands, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope. She placed the note on her kitchen table, alongside the others the dog had left her. Each one was a testament to the love they had shared, a love that had been unspoken yet deeply felt. She smiled through her tears, knowing that the dog had left her with more than just words. It had left her with a heart full of memories, and that was something she would never forget. Years passed, but Claire would always think of the stray dog who had changed her life. And in the quiet moments, when she sat on her porch watching the sun set, she would feel its presence beside her once again, as though it was never truly gone. The dog's love had left its mark on her, and no matter where life took her, she would carry that love with her always. A love that had come from the most unexpected place, a love that had healed her heart. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. And every once in a while, as the wind whispered through the trees, she would find another note, carried by the breeze: "You were never alone." With that, Claire knew that the dog's love would live on forever, in every word it had written, in every quiet moment they had shared, and in the peace it had given her when she needed it the most. And so, she carried on, no longer alone, but filled with a quiet, enduring love that had come when she least expected it, just as it had come for the dog. Years had passed since Claire had last seen the stray dog. The memory of the quiet, loving creature that had touched her heart so deeply lingered in the back of her mind, like a fading photograph, slowly losing its color but never quite disappearing. She had moved on, in a sense. Life had a way of pushing people forward, forcing them to live in the present, to move past the pain and embrace new moments. But the lessons the dog had taught her, the kindness it had shown, were never truly forgotten. She still lived in the same house, the same quiet suburban neighborhood, where the days drifted by almost imperceptibly. Her mornings had settled into a routine of coffee and newspaper, her afternoons filled with work, and her evenings spent either reading, watching TV, or tending to the small garden she had cultivated over the years. The house, though cozy, felt different now, emptier. She didn't know why, but there was always a vague, unshakable sense of longing that seemed to follow her through every room. Some nights, Claire would stand on the porch, looking out into the street, remembering the quiet rustling of the leaves when the stray dog had come around. She'd recall how, despite its rough appearance and silent presence, it had become a constant companion, the one being who had listened to her darkest fears, her most fragile thoughts. In return, she had given it scraps of food and a small patch of her heart. What had seemed like a one-sided relationship had actually been the foundation of something far deeper, something she didn't fully understand until it was too late. She hadn't realized how much she missed the dog until she found herself standing there one evening, her hand resting on the doorframe, gazing into the horizon. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden glow over the streets. She had always loved this time of day, when everything seemed to pause, holding its breath before nightfall. It reminded her of the dog, the way it had silently appeared each night, always there when the day began to slip into darkness. A soft breeze blew through the air, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn, and Claire couldn't help but smile softly to herself. She'd come to terms with the loss of the dog, but a part of her still longed for it. Perhaps that's why she found herself standing there now, as though expecting the dog to show up once again, as it had done so many times before. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something fluttering in the breeze. Claire turned quickly, her heart leaping in her chest. Could it be a note? She approached the door with tentative steps, her pulse quickening with each movement. Sure enough, as she reached down, she found a small, crumpled piece of paper, its edges slightly frayed from being carried by the wind. She knelt down, carefully unwrapping the note, her hands trembling slightly as she read the words. "You were never alone." Claire's breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was familiar, but the message was even more profound. She felt a lump form in her throat as the tears began to well up in her eyes. The note was simple, but it carried with it so much meaning, the final lesson from the dog. The love it had shared with her, the companionship it had offered, had never truly ended. It was still with her, in every moment, in every breath. The dog had never really left, it had simply been a part of her life for as long as she needed it to be. Claire stood there for a long time, her hand clutching the note to her chest, feeling the wind play gently with her hair. The street around her was quiet, save for the distant chirp of crickets, but in that moment, she felt the dog's presence beside her once again, as though it was standing just beyond the edge of her vision, silently watching over her. She thought back to the years that had passed since that first encounter with the stray dog. She had come a long way since then. The loneliness that had once consumed her had faded, replaced by a sense of peace. The dog had helped her heal, given her something she hadn't even known she needed: hope. Hope that things could get better, that she wasn't as alone as she had once believed. As the years went by, Claire had found new ways to connect with others. She had rekindled old friendships, joined a local book club, even started volunteering at a nearby animal shelter. But none of those relationships had ever quite matched the bond she had shared with the dog. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about understanding. The dog had seen her for who she was, accepted her flaws and imperfections without judgment. It had given her the kind of unconditional love that she had never truly experienced before. That love had transformed her. It had opened her eyes to the fact that love wasn't something that had to come from a person. It could come from anyone or anything, even a stray dog. The dog had never asked for anything in return. It had simply given, freely and without expectation. And in that selflessness, Claire had learned what it meant to truly love and be loved in return. Now, as she stood on the porch, holding the final note, Claire realized that the dog had done for her what no one else could. It had given her the strength to move forward, to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that love, in all its forms, would always be there for her. The wind whispered through the trees once again, and Claire smiled through her tears, the note still pressed to her chest. She felt the dog's presence surrounding her, a warm, comforting embrace that filled her heart. It was as though the dog had left behind not just its love, but a part of its spirit, which would continue to guide her throughout her life. A soft mewling sound interrupted her thoughts, and Claire looked down to see a small tabby kitten sitting on the steps. It was scruffy and unkempt, much like the dog had been when they first met. Claire crouched down, extending her hand toward the kitten, who cautiously sniffed her fingers before nuzzling against her palm. She chuckled softly, realizing that life had a way of bringing unexpected companions when they were needed most. The kitten may not have been the dog, but it didn't need to be. It was a new chapter, a new beginning, and Claire welcomed it with open arms. In that moment, she understood something deep within her: the love that the dog had given her would never fade. It had changed her life forever, and in turn, she would continue to carry its love with her, sharing it with the world in whatever way she could. The dog had taught her that love was not just an emotion, it was a force, a power that could heal, transform, and transcend time. As Claire stood there, holding the note and the kitten in her hands, she realized that love had no boundaries. It didn't matter if the dog was gone, its love would always be with her, always guiding her, always reminding her that she was never truly alone. The sunset faded into twilight, and Claire smiled, feeling the presence of the dog one last time, this time in her heart. And with that, she knew that the dog's love would never end, just as the lessons it had taught her would live on forever. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.